This is our moment. We owe it to Europe itself, a Europe of sovereign nations, strong economies and proud people. We will fight. We will not back down.
Tady jsou bruselské chlebíčky, váš průvodce zákulisím politiky v Evropské unii.
In 2 weeks, Czechs will decide in the elections about the new composition of the parliament and indirectly on the form of the new government. The results of the elections and the possible return of Andrej Babiš to the position of prime minister are nervously awaited by Brussels, the European Commission and also other member states. Will the Czech Republic become another Hungary or Slovakia, another European rebel that blocks EU decision-making and undermines European unity? And what is the reputation of the current government of Petr Fiala here in Brussels? That's the topic of today's Brussels Bites. I'm Zdenka Trachtová, hello from Brussels, and our guest today is Brussels Bureau Chief of the Financial Times Henry Foy. Hello, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Henry, I said that the European Union is nervous about the upcoming election in Czech Republic. Would you say it's true, and what are the expectations here in Brussels about these elections?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, on paper, the Commission is open to democracy and is looking forward to a good and open process. I think, as you've said in the introduction, most people here are assuming that Andrej Babiš will return to power in some form. I think the question is about coalition building and sort of what kind of parties would be in there with him. I'm struck by how there's a lot of similarity with the 2017 election, when, of course, Babiš was the number one party but needed to form a government with partners. So I think it will be interesting to see how the last few weeks of campaigning go, how those numbers might shift, and then the results. I think in terms of expectations on Babiš, which we can talk about in more detail later, there is nervousness here, but at the same time, there's a little bit more calm around the idea that they've seen Babiš before. They know what he stands for. And let's face it, Brussels has now done a decade of Orbán, at least, being difficult, and with Fico as well. There's an understanding that Brussels can keep working even with these people around the UK table.
Before we focus more on the future of the Czech Republic, could you maybe tell me how is the current government, led by Petr Fiala, perceived in the European Union and here in Brussels?
I mean, Fiala was pretty much an unknown when he became prime minister. There was kind of uncertainty over what he would stand for, of course, from the ECR as well. So there was the nervousness around where his politics would be. But in fact, it's been a revelation. I think a lot of people here in Brussels are really very impressed with the work of that government. I think certainly with regards to Ukraine and support for Ukraine, they've been a really important partner inside NATO as well as the EU, and sort of on other issues where perhaps more centrist parties would be worried about how a party from that political family might operate, there haven't actually been that many flare-ups. And on some of the issues where maybe migration or energy, where you would have seen Petr Fiala's government in the past be more, I don't want to say extreme, but taking a firmer stance. Actually, the mainstream EU has moved in that direction over the last few years anyway. So in a way, he's sort of always been a sort of mainstream voice. And the kind of Euroscepticism that people were afraid of before he came to power hasn't really materialized.
Yeah, that was my next question, because his civil democrats are traditionally perceived as a slightly Eurosceptic in the Czech Republic, although he would say more like Euro-realistic.
Euro-realistic, yeah, this
Exactly.
is the favorite term.
They don't want Euro, they don't want greater EU integration, but that is not how Fiala is viewed here in Brussels.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's mainly because, as I said before, the sort of mainstream has moved not in a more Eurosceptic position, but certainly views that were considered more extremist are now becoming sort of acceptable. I think, when you talk about opposition to the euro, nobody would say that Donald Tusk was a Eurosceptic, but his government in Poland is also sort of opposed to Euro integration. I think when it comes to greater EU federalization, there are many governments who consider themselves centrist, who also would agree with Fiala. I'm struck by, I remember when the new parliament was being formed after the elections last summer, that Fiala's group was kind of seen as like ECR people we can deal with, you know. And so I was told a lot of Czech MEPs were given quite senior jobs because it was a way of making sure the more extreme parties were given stuff. I remember when we talked about top jobs even, people were saying, well, you know, if it was a Czech nominee, we could have an ECR HRVP, High Representative, if we needed one of those parties. Yeah, it was an early discussion because he was sort of seen as somebody who kind of walked and talked like an EPP, but actually was from a different party. So I think nobody would say, oh yeah, Fiala, he's a Eurosceptic. He's there with Orbán and Fico. And when you look at it, in a way, you could say that the Finnish coalition or the Swedish coalition with their far-right parties are far more of a sort of Eurosceptic danger than Fiala himself.
Would you say that Fiala is visible leader?
No, I mean the fact that he doesn't speak English, he's not a hugely kind of press friendly character, which is totally fine. I don't think, you know, I think in today's day and age, you know, we feel that we have to see someone on TV or on social media or on podcasts all the time for them to actually be working, whereas actually Fiala's definitely demonstrate this reputation of sort of being a doer rather than a sayer. And then, of course, you have to put it in the context of the Czech president, who's obviously very, very visible and very media friendly and obviously incredibly handsome and good looking and great for TV. In the NATO setting, it kind of gives Fiala a bit more space. He had some quite outspoken ministers, if I recall, at the other councils who would do a lot of the Czech press, if you like. So you know, Fiala is sort of the quiet man, dependable. But I know that inside the Berlaymont, they hugely respect him and really sort of welcome of his support and his work over the government.
It is true that he's not very visible in foreign media and he doesn't do doorsteps, for example, before European councils. Did you ever talk to him?
We actually tried many times to get an interview and it never happened, which is fair enough. You know, like I said, an hour spent talking to the FT is an hour where he could actually be doing some government work. So, you know...
so he's viewed as a man behind who's doing the work but cannot really sell it in public.
Exactly, or doesn't need to sell it in public and has others to sell it in public. But like I said, you know, the work with Ukraine, the work around the UCO to try to get consensus on key issues, I think there was quite a spotlight put on the Czech Republic and its other countries that were more pro-Israel over the last couple of years. But I wouldn't say he's sort of seen in a more blocking way like Viktor Orbán of Hungary or even the Germans and the Austrians.
But maybe on the issue of Israel he is, because we see that more and more countries are taking a tougher approach towards Israel. But the Czech Republic is an exception.
Yeah, I think if I had one criticism of the Fiala administration, it would be that perhaps they didn't do enough explaining in public of their positions, and I think people would be a bit like, why is the Czech Republic so pro-Israel, and why are they taking these positions? That's somewhere maybe that there could have been more forward-leaning engagement here in Brussels and with the foreign media. But again, he could say, look, you know, do your own research. My job is to run the country, not to talk to journalists.
Let's go to Andrej Babiš. So he is currently clearly leading in the polls. He would probably return to the post of prime minister. What would it mean for the European Union?
It's a really great question. I'm gonna take you back to February 2016. I interviewed Andrej Babiš. At that time, he was deputy prime minister and finance minister, and he was very upset with me before this interview. This was a lunch with the FT. And he said to me, quote, "Adding me into this article with Orbán and Fico, it is completely wrong." Second quote, "I am not Orbán. It is not true." This, of course, was before he came to power as prime minister. And I know that from that interview and from subsequent interactions with him, you know, Andrej often likes to take two sides and you never really know exactly where he stands. But in a way, he does have a point here. Orbán is an ideologue. Orbán is somebody who wants to change the EU and disrupt it as much as he can. Fico is much more of a kind of classic crony capitalist. He's in this for his own end and sort of to remain in power. I mean, Mr. Babiš, let's face it, is a multi-billionaire who doesn't need politics. He's choosing to do it. I think there are elements of both Orbán and Fico in him. Certainly there was in his first term as prime minister, but not the complete package. I think, you know, on many issues, he's able to go with the EU mainstream. Obviously, as a businessman, fully understands the importance of, say, the single market, for example, to not just only his own business interests, but to the Czech Republic in general. I think the big question will be on where does he stand vis-a-vis Russia, where does he stand vis-a-vis Russian energy, and where does he stand vis-a-vis the sort of economic reintegration of Russia post-war. I'm of the view that we shouldn't take too much into account from an election campaign. People will say anything to get elected, both good and bad. But I think that's the area where people are looking to see just how much of a Fico and Orbán Babiš will be in his second shot as Prime Minister.
So you think that this comparison to Fico and Orbán is not really working?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, it's a little bit of a sloppy shorthand thing. Anyway, I mean, you could argue over the last year or so, Fico and Orbán themselves haven't been that aligned. I think if they weren't in a very similar situation vis-a-vis Russian oil and gas, they might not be as aligned. There are certain areas where it's in their interest to stand side by side. There are certain areas where they want to diverge. And let's face it, the Donald Trump element here has kind of made the two of them question where they're going to stand, especially on Ukraine and what we're seeing in the last few weeks with Trump's position. So, yes, like I said, there will be elements of the policy program of Ursula von der Leyen where they'll be worried that Andrej Babiš will join Fico and Orbán in being a sort of blocking minority. And other areas where I think they will see a man that they can do deals with. I mean, ultimately, that is what he's spent his life doing.
This might depend to a large extent on the final coalition, because if he goes with far right, it might be a completely different Babiš than Babiš in the coalition with some mainstream political party.
That's very true, of course. And also, you know, the state of the Czech economy, the state of relations with other countries around, the relationship with Friedrich Merz of Germany, which is obviously a very important one for the country. I mean, there are lots of other factors that will play into this, aside from simply his personality and his personal views.
Babiš has already been prime minister once. How do you remember this era?
I mean, to go back to this interview, he told me on the record, quote, "I did not want to go to politics. I'm very unhappy in politics. It has destroyed my life." And sort of made this point to me that he wanted people to feel sorry for him, that he had to be in politics. And I said to him, yes, so what about if you win the next election, which was the 2017 election, would you be prime minister? He said, well, of course I have to be, you know, if the people choose me. So for me, I find it kind of amusing that he's going again. So, you know, to quote Shakespeare, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. I think he sees himself as unfinished business, plus the fact that, you know, politics can be quite addictive, and certainly power. But to answer your question directly, I remember him being a front runner on migration, perhaps ahead of his time in a way. Not that I agree with many of the views he was putting across, but when you think about where we are now as a result of Giorgia Meloni's politics in Italy, Mette Frederiksen's politics in Denmark, and the general kind of shifting of what people consider acceptable on migration, led by Germany, but also frontier states, the Baltics and Poland, with what happened with Belarus, and the instrumentalization of illegal migration as a hybrid method of destabilization. You know, a lot of the things Babiš was saying back in 2017 that people thought were quite extreme are now sort of much more mainstream. And in a way, you had him, you had the Brits coming out with stuff that people said, this is outrageous, this is borderline racism. Now is quite normal. In fact, the debate, certainly in Denmark and Italy, has actually moved past where they were. So that's the first thing. The second one was he, in a way, heralded this discussion over Russian energy. I remember Agrofert, obviously a massive buyer of Russian gas at the time, and there were big discussions over sort of the future energy mix of the EU, and he was one of these voices saying, you know, gas needs to be a big part of that. So I think that aspect, the energy policies of the Babiš government will be really important as we look ahead in the next the next 4 years, I suppose, that are left of the von der Leyen Commission, in terms of energy mix of Europe, in terms of the role, if any, that Russia will play in that, and future climate targets. I mean, these are areas where I think Babiš's first term gives us a lot of pointers for how he might operate in his second term.
In many ways, Babiš party, ANO, has a very similar views as Petr Fiala and his Civil Democrats. Maybe the difference would be Ukraine. Do you think that it can change dramatically?
I mean, look, you're right, but I would counter argument by saying, look at Slovakia. You know, Fico was outspoken in being less supportive of Ukraine and more kind of understanding of Russia's position and talking for peace. Of course, he went to Moscow. But at the same time, Slovakian defense companies were making a lot of money producing, refining, replenishing Ukrainian ammunition stocks. You know, no prime minister of Czech Republic is going to come in and stop a very lucrative defense industry from supplying weapons to Ukraine. So there's a difference there. You know, when you're in opposition, when you are sort of trying to win disaffected votes, when you've got a population that's worried about war, you can talk about the dangers of this war. You become prime minister, and all of a sudden, the export earnings and the tax receipts from defense companies in the Czech Republic, that's a very important thing to think about. And also, you know, like I said before, the role of NATO as well and the Czech Republic in that EU-NATO context and supporting Ukraine gives Prague a stronger voice than it had during Babiš's first term. So I would be cautious of this idea that Babiš is going to come in and completely turn Czech policy around with regards to Ukraine, because there have been lots of benefits from it. But then, of course, there is this underlying, you could call it pro-Russian, you could say sort of soft pro-Russian stance of Babiš for decades. And of course, if that does come through at the UKO, it could be an even bigger problem than we have already. Though, of course, there's the other issue here, which you could have a situation of one in, one out, which is Babiš arrives this autumn and we lose Orbán next year.
Yes, because there will be elections in Hungary next year. That's true. Maybe one more question about the communication, because we mentioned that Petr Fiala was not very open to media, and you said that you asked him repeatedly for the interview without success. So Babiš was different, right?
Yeah, I mean, Babiš was very happy to chat. You know, he speaks fluent English. He knows the power of the foreign media. He understands personal branding. I remember in the interview we did in 2016, I told him that everyone compared him to Berlusconi, which he was very upset by, but, you know, owned TV channels and newspapers and sort of was this larger-than-life character. I think you will see him utilize that. I think I would be very surprised if he ignored doorsteps and didn't do the interviews like we've seen Fiala do, mainly because he's very aware that you can use the media, you can use your voice, you can use social media, which of course he's much more kind of attuned to than other rivals in his country, to influence the policy debate. We all know, I mean, we do this every few months at the summits. If a leader comes out and says something really explosive and flashy on the doorsteps, that can lead the day's news. Lots of leaders are incredibly outspoken and fantastical to journalists, and then they say nothing in the room. Yes, I think you'll see a sort of a flamboyant, fun Babiš trying to get our attention and demonstrating his understanding of how the media works.
Last question about Babiš, because his political party, it belongs to, also in the European Parliament, to the group of Patriots for Europe, which is often described as a far right. Would you say that Babiš and his political party is far right?
It's a great question. Look, I think I will plead that, like I said before, you need to see a party in office before you really judge them. I don't think during the campaign he's been so outspoken as for you to be able to say this is a far-right party. And the very notion of what is a far-right party is shifting, of course, as the sort of migration center becomes more to the right anyway. No, I think in a way he's a more palatable party inside the Patriots, a little bit like Fiala was a more palatable, more centrist part of the ECR.
Do you think that the political importance of Eastern and Central European states within the European Union has increased in connection with the war in the Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess it comes down to how you measure importance. I would say the focus of the Commission, the focus of the other 27 or the 27 in total has become much more on Central Europe. I was struck how we now consider kind of Finland, right, to be a Central European country. That is because of Russia. But now we think about sort of frontline states rather than Eastern and Central European states. And I think in that sense, yes, the role, the importance of them is much more pronounced now. It's about money, ultimately. That's what the EU doles out. And you can see look at the way the safe loans have been assigned. The vast majority are going to Central and Eastern European frontline states. It's down to policy proposals. We talk every single summit about Orbán and Hungary for good and bad reasons. I think, because of the importance of weapons supplies to Ukraine, because of the threat posed by Russia daily, they're getting much more headlines, and the clever ones can turn those headlines into influence. I get invited to so many more events, trips, tours to countries now in the east of the EU. I think their leaders are getting much more airtime. Their ministers are getting much more freedom to sort of shape the narrative in FACs, in foreign affairs councils, general affairs councils, even in the ECOFIN, and so you have the economic rise from 2004. You now have the kind of geopolitical rise from 2022. And, while there's still a long way to go before say, the Visegrad Four are considered on the par with France and Germany, the gap in terms of power and influence has certainly narrowed over the last 3 years, yes, without a doubt.
And how do you explain that these European leaders, like Orbán and Fico, the ones who are close to the Russian borders, they are the ones who mostly show sympathies for Putin? Isn't it paradox?
There is definitely a paradox there, but you can also be incredibly cynical and say, look, a lot of this is business. The countries to the east will always have relied on Russia more for energy in particular, but also for trade. There's also the Euroscepticism angle. Countries that joined the EU later in the EU's journey always were susceptible to a more Eurosceptic idea. And really, Poland and some of the Baltic states haven't seen this, but in most of those countries, you have a pro-Russian Eurosceptic party. Because Russia, in a way, is the ultimate anti-EU. You don't get many Eurosceptic parties being like, we should be like Norway or Switzerland, because not everyone has gold and oil. So Russia, and because Russia is very, very willing to support these parties that stand on that line, you see a kind of more pro-Russian Eurosceptic parties coming through. Do I think that Slovakia and Hungary should be considered pro-Russian countries? No, not at all. But they have two leaders who, through ideological bent, economic necessity, or simply because it's an easy argument to make, have turned to pro-Russian ideas to influence their own parties and to win votes. And I mean, that's sort of the really quite sad thing here, right? I mean, Orbán is quite a skilled politician, and in a different world may well have risen to power in a different way. I mean, the man started off as a liberal funded by George Soros, and realized the easiest way to take power and keep it was to be more pro-Russian and anti-Soros.
Orbán and American President Donald Trump, we can see that they have been showing affection to each other.
Well, I think they've been showing affection in one way.
Sympathies. One way?
Yeah, I think Trump is far less enamored of Orbán than Orbán is enamored of Trump.
Okay. But they call each other friends. Trump called Viktor Orbán his friend.
That's true.
But lately, he began to push Hungary and Slovakia to stop buying Russian oil and gas. But Orbán and Fico were so far refusing EU plan to get rid of Russian fossil fuels. So do you think that this pressure from Trump can help and can change something?
I do, though Trump is pushing the whole of the EU to do that, right? And to put sanctions on India and China. There he's going to be stuck, I think, because I think a lot of countries, not just Slovakia and Hungary, will have a problem with that. The Orbán-Trump thing is bizarre when you think about it. You can see why Orbán would want Trump's endorsement and would want sort of support from him. But at the same time, Orbán is, as we've said, pro-Russian. Orbán takes a huge amount of Chinese investment and support, and he's also trying to be best friends with Trump. I mean, if you're a European leader in 2025, you do not want to find yourself in a position where whatever you do, you're going to upset 2 out of 3 of Russia, China, and the US. I mean, that is not a good position he's navigated himself into, and so he needs to find a way out of that. And I think, look, you look at the White House meeting of the European leaders with Trump, there's no Orbán there. He's referring to Meloni and Stubbs, his great friend. At one point, he even refers to Ursula von der Leyen as probably the most powerful person around the table. You know, these are words that will not go down very well in Budapest, which for the last 9 months have been saying, we're the best friend of Donald Trump. He hates the EU, you know, and sort of soft positioning Orbán as the man to speak to the White House. It's pretty clear to me, at least, that Trump doesn't see it that way. You know, he'd rather talk to Rutte or Stubb or Meloni, Merz, even von der Leyen than Orbán.
Not Orbán.
Yeah. And, you know, to bring it back to Babiš, you know, that would be interesting. You know, what is that relationship like? Trump's obviously gone full in for Karol Nawrocki, the new president of Poland. He's being very cold-shouldered towards Prime Minister Tusk. You know, where does he land in the Czech Republic? Who does he want to talk to? Does he see Babiš as a man he can do business with, or does he sort of ignore him? That's very interesting, and we'll see.
Well, one thing that can complicate this relationship is that Donald Trump is pushing Europe to invest more to defense, and Andrej Babiš, he clearly said that he will not respect 5% target to defense of NATO.
Well, again, he said that in the campaign. Let's see what happens when he comes to power, if he comes to power. And also, you know, you sit down, you have a security briefing, and someone says to you, look, this is how much American defense is worth to us. This is how much our own defense industry can make from 5%. Babiš might change his tune quite quickly.
Also, Trump recently said that the White House is prepared to impose tough sanctions on Russia, but only if NATO countries stop buying Russian oil. Do you think it's a realistic request?
I mean, I think if he can wait to 2027, that's the EU position.
But not Turkey, for example.
That's a good point. Yes, Turkey might be in trouble. Is Trump thinking about Europe when he says that? Does Trump know the difference between the EU and NATO? Does Trump really have a plan on this? I'm not fully convinced, forgive me. I think it's a legitimate demand, and I think the fact that the EU have set themselves a target to get rid of Russian oil and gas completely is a sign that they know it needs to be done. But I think, I mean, you and I do the same job here. It took months and months and months of arguing to get that 2027 target. I would be amazed if there's a consensus on bringing it forward. And, you know, the Hungarians and the Slovaks have really dug in on this, and it could get quite messy. But it depends whether Trump blames Brussels or blames Bratislava and Budapest.
The guest of Brussels Bites was Henry Foy, the chief of Brussels Bureau of Financial Times. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much.